That's a very well-mannered way to begin, isn't it? Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to have you here. Look, I'm an expert in this in two ways. There's firstly the form guide, which I think gives me an insight into contemporary behaviour and contemporary manners, a weekly discussion where people ring in and talk about their dilemmas. But my other expertise comes from my background. I was raised by Victorians, both in time and space. I grew up in the state of Victoria, in country Victoria, and in fact, as soon as I walked into the exhibition, I went, Ballarat Art Gallery 1965. That's all they had. Big Victorian paintings and a couple of Norman Lindsays. Maybe a Percy Lindsay as well, I think, but that was it. So I went, right, yes, I know where I am. But I was also raised by Victorians in time. My grandfather, my mother's father, was born in 1888. And I knew him and he lived until I was maybe 15 or 16. He married a woman born in the 1890s. They had my mother in 1927. If you do the math, you realise they were a very unusual couple for that time. A bit old to be breeding in that era. My father's mother was born in 1900, and there's not much known about his father. Not because he was, untoward. He just disappeared at some point. So I knew the Victorians. My mother remained suspicious of the 20th century. Didn't like it. Didn't think much of it. Didn't think much was achieved. My mother, much happier in the Victorian era, in the 19th century. So much so that I grew up in Ballarat in Victoria, and my mother loved the Victorian era so much, she owned a crinoline. She had an actual crinoline. There was a reason for this. She was a founding committee member of Sovereign Hill, which is the historical village in Ballarat. So she loved the Victorian era so much, she wanted to build it again. She wanted a shrine to it in Ballarat. Sovereign Hill was meant to capture Ballarat as it was in 1850 to 1864, 1862, when the train arrived. That ruined everything, really. It's a lovely place up until then. Lovely outpost of the Empire. She loved the Victorian era. She loved... my mother's favourite thing would be Sunday night and the Forsyte saga is on. And not the lovely colour version you saw, the black and white one for about 1972, which went for 87 episodes. It was her other favourite. I remember sitting through... There was an interminable one based on an Anthony Trollope novel, a series of novels, I think called The Palaces. I think I've got that right. Is that right, The Palaces? 800 episodes. All about men in handlebar moustaches struggling to find any emotion whatsoever. Shocking things. So I knew the Victorians well. Victorian manners in my childhood were alive and well. Men wore ties and hats everywhere. Women wore hats and gloves. People dressed properly. You had good clothes. You didn't leave the house in your house dress. Wouldn't occur to you. You wouldn't just wander out like you have tonight, you ragtag bunch. Look at you. You'd all have lovely clothes if you were going to a public event. You'd have proper sort of garb on, In my grandfather's house, which had barely 3 bedrooms, a tiny little corridor, 3 bedrooms and a kitchen, the largest room was a formal parlour. A formal room with furniture unchanged from the 19th century. Chiffoniers, sideboards, chaise lounges were in this room. No one ever reclined on the chaise lounge. There was no reason for it whatsoever. But it sat among cabinets full of porcelain figures and crockery, and it was a completely unused room. You never went to that room except with the vicar. If somebody came to call in a formal kind of manner, if cousins you didn't like came round, you took them into there. It was unheard of to entertain in the kitchen. Maybe if you were actual intimate family, but otherwise anybody else was taken into this formal room, this useless formal room. My parents replicated that room. We had that room. We had a similar home, not very large, but the largest area of the house was a formal lounge room. You were not permitted to go into it. And there was French polished antique mahogany furniture through this room. There was a table used only at Christmas. There was a thing called a chiffonier, which was about as big as a Honda. It was enormous, and it contained wine glasses and cutlery, which is only used on special occasions. We had fish knives. Haven't seen a fish knife for a long time. Most people manage to get the fish off the bone with any implement near at hand these days. Then you had to have a fish knife. Our table was always set with a butter knife. Butter was transferred from the little tray with a butter knife. Oh, terribly unseemly to use any other kind of knife. Everyone addressed everyone as Mr. and Mrs. People could work with one another forever, and you never knew their first name or what they did. All of the values of the Victorian era were present in my childhood. People worked hard. People knew their place. People were modest and proud of that modesty. You didn't display things. You didn't display your wealth. You know, Sydney was a very unseemly town. You were sensible. You were frugal. Passion was frowned upon. Enthusiasm was greeted with great suspicion. It was all very good, perhaps, to play sport and to applaud those that were good at it, but there was something a little unnatural if you yourself pursued it at that sort of level. It should be a sensible hobby, you know, to be fixed on something and have that sort of drive. There was something a bit wrong with that. Music was all right, but not if you did too much of it. A girl might learn the piano, but there'd be something wrong if she was very good at it. That would be not quite right. It'd be lovely if she could entertain people, older people perhaps, in the evening, but a career at it was wrong. Emotions were treated as we might now treat a rash. Best if hidden, not expressed. Women who were emotional were hysterical. Men who were emotional were women. These are the values of my youth. These are alive and well in 1960s Ballarat, 1970s Ballarat when I'm growing up. I'm born in 1961. So I am born to a quite old woman and man, like they were already late 30s when they're having me, who had late parents themselves. There's only it's two generations in 100 years in my family. So that's why I know the Victorians. My mother cherished the values that she got from her parents and lived them out in our life. My mother was one of the most Victorian things you could be. She was an elocution teacher. Now, people today probably think, oh, elocution, that's speaking well. It's more than speaking well, it's moving class. It's removing your working class origins from your speech so you can move into proper society. See, my fair lady. My mother's favourite thing. You know, that's what she did. The common view seems to me today that we look at those times, we look at the 50s and 60s, we look at the Victorian era, and we think, what a time of great good manners this were. What a civil society this was. Wasn't it fabulous? People were courteous. Lovely manners existed. People thanked one another. People spoke politely to one another. They addressed letters properly. They RSVP'd on time. They wrote a thank you note after a social gathering. Doors were open, chairs were pulled out. Strong language was discouraged. Things were polite. People behaved properly. Children were taught how to behave. They were taught good manners, and woe betide them if they didn't behave properly when they were out. The general view is that this is perhaps the last time that these kind of manners existed and prevailed in the Western world. These manners that we're exalting at this time, that we're saying, you know, isn't this terrific, what a courteous society, these were Victorian manners. These are the direct descendant of the kind of things that we understand existed in Victorian England and Victorian Australia. We read and watch the bonnet dramas. We read Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility. Now, these are pre-Victorian, of course, it's 1810, 1820, but we note all of that elaborate, ritualistic courtesy in those things between all the characters, and we love it. We go, oh, isn't that wonderful? You know, wouldn't society be better if all that existed today? We believe that in Victoria's England, the manners were refined then to a really extreme level. They were really good at it. It was wonderful. Everything was in its place. People knew how to behave to one another. At court, among the middle and upper classes, strict rules of decorum and protocol were observed, and this carried through society, created a lovely cohesive society where everyone was polite. And this, of course, carried through to the empire. In some ways, the British Empire was legitimate because they had good manners. It was okay to rule an entire nation because you were the civilised ones. You'll bring good manners. You'll bring getting places on time, responding properly to an invitation. That's what you're bringing to these damned fuzzy wuzzies. They know how to behave. We will bring decent behaviour to them. You can almost see exactly the same attitude in the US today, in the American attitude. Well, why wouldn't you want us here? We behave properly. American life is good life. Why would you not want us, you know? Because I think of my upbringing and the way in which I saw my parents and their society use manners as these strict rules of behaviour, not as ways of interacting warmly with one another, of ways of being compassionate with all human beings, but as ways of sort of saying, I am a well-mannered person and you're not. Because of this kind of thing, I have a very different view. I see good manners as incredibly rude. I see them as a way of creating a distance between you and I, as a way of formalising the relationship so I don't have to actually interact with you. I don't believe that these manners that were taught to me had anything to do with people trying to get along better with one another, to helping everybody understand one another, to make a better world. I was taught these manners to put a firm stamp on me as a member of the middle class, as a respectable young lad. These behaviours and rituals were entirely about recognising that in each other. We're in the same group because we know how to use a fork. Let us discuss the fork. I meant to bring one with me. It's much easier to demonstrate than talk about. I was instructed in fork technique, not from a nutritional point of view or consideration of others or anything else, but from a public relations point of view. Hold your fork, tines down, left hand, cut, poke, eat like that. Tines down. Anything else, if I do anything else, others will think I have been poorly brought up. Every single injunction from my family about good manners was always followed by that caveat. Do this, I don't want other people to think that you have bad manners. I have taught you better than that. You know how to behave. You are the kind of person who knows how to do it properly. They don't. And you will go out and represent us as a proper, respectable person who knows how to use the fork properly. We would recognise those at table who were poorly brought up because they'd shovel. And as for Americans, just didn't get it. Let's discuss the first letter of the word house. My mother would insist, and there's those who have had this discussion their entire lives as well. My mother would insist that the first letter of the word house is a letter called H. Now, that's not because it matters whether it is called H or H or Barbara. It's because in 1960s in Ballarat, it wouldn't do to say H because people might mistake you for a Catholic. That's what that was about. The stupid Catholic schools taught their rotten, stinking, potato-eating offspring to say H. And we don't want anybody to think you're one of them. Now, this brings me to my main reaction that I have when people are nostalgic for the courtesies and politeness of the past, of the Victorian era, and believe that we now live in some sort of less civil time and a time when manners were absent. In this lovely golden era of great courtesy to one another, it was perfectly acceptable for Anglicans to despise Catholics. That was fine. They were not to be befriended, they were not to be employed, and they weren't meant to be loved. You couldn't marry one. No way. Mixed marriage, get out of here. I found one. I married one. And both my mother and her mother had a very strong reaction to it. They weren't sure it was the right thing. Her mother cried when we said, we're getting married in an Anglican church. My wife's reaction was, I didn't say I had cancer. A complete disregard for people because of their belief system seems pretty goddamn rude to me. It was okay in my childhood for comedians to tell jokes about Jews. That was fine. No worries. It was okay to equate Jewishness with everything that Shylock embodied in Shakespeare. That was fine. Jews were stingy. That was just a tenet of society. That was common held belief, and it was okay to talk about it in a perfectly normal way. My view of previous eras, of the Victorian era, of the era I grew up in, with the delightful Edwardian era of Regency England or whatever, is that there's enormous institutionalised rudeness to all sorts of people in society that doesn't really make up for a bit of an opening of a car door here and there, you know? A little bit of courtesy between members of the same class, recognising one another because of the way they use the fork, doesn't make up for the incredible rudeness that it was okay to exact upon almost every other member of society. It was poor form, for example, and I had a huge fight with my father about this one day, it was great. It was poor form to use profane language in front of a woman. Good God, I wouldn't even say damn in front of a woman, my father said. It was perfectly okay, however, to ignore her at every other occasion. Women were second-class citizens and were expected to behave like it. They were not expected to join in when the men were talking. They were not expected to be educated. They were not expected to work beyond secretarial and primary teaching, and then only until they were married or pregnant. And that better occur in that order, or you were in big trouble. Relationships were an entire area of institutionalised rudeness. You had to be married by quite a young age. If a woman wasn't married by 22 or 23, spinster, bit of a problem there. What's happening? If you were married and you hadn't had kids, bit of a problem there. What's going on? Should have been pregnant within the year. If you were pregnant before marriage, shunted up the country to give birth. No sense of like, that's okay, we'll try and deal with it. Gee, what a shame, what a pity. How can we embrace this? You know, we understand, we're compassionate about it. Get out of here, you've brought shame to the family. Absolutely appalling. This is not an exaggeration. This is not some mini-series. This is not a novel. This is Australia in the 1960s. This is middle-class country Victoria in the 1960s and the 1970s. Post-war Australia, no population debate. Populate or perish was the slogan, and Dick Smith wouldn't have gone on the ABC for 5 seconds with an alternative view. Hundreds of thousands of Poms, Wogs, Jippos, Refos, Slavs and New Australians arrived, and it was perfectly okay to refer to them like that. That's what they were, mate. It was okay to ignore their actual names and turn every Giacomo and Giovanni into Jackson Johns. It was okay to laugh at their accent. It was okay to suggest that they stink and their food was horrible. They were lucky to be here and they better learn our ways. The idea they might contribute something or that we might learn from them, rubbish. Bloody lucky to get out here. Racism was absolutely fine. That seems to me like an enormously institutionalised rudeness that a little bit of please and thank you doesn't really wash over. Let's not forget there was already a bunch of people who were already here that it was okay to be incredibly rude to. That would be the Indigenous Australians, and it was very nice of us in 1967 to declare them citizens of the country. Children, those well-behaved children with such good manners, were basically entirely ignored. Anybody could whack any kid they liked on any pretext whatsoever. It's perfectly fine. Idiot, boof. Teachers, boof. Walking down the street, boof. No one had to talk to them or consider their needs or wishes at any time. You're a kid. Shut up, get out of my way, do what I'm doing. I don't care, I'm not listening to you. That's why you hear people say things today like, no kid in my day had a peanut allergy. No. That is because if you did, no one noticed and you died. I don't like the peanuts, shut up. If middle class, it was perfectly okay to be patronising and condescending to the working class. The middle class discouraged friendships with the working class, and middle class families would cut off members who failed to make the grade. Brothers who couldn't become articled clerks or get a job in the bank and went off shearing were never heard of again. Daughters who fell in love with bricklayers, the same. So I don't have a sense of this being a very well-mannered time. I have a sense of this being incredibly kind of rude, a time when people excluded all sorts of other people. Nothing flowed very naturally, was my observation of things. My mother wrote thank you notes before the event to make sure she'd done it. You know, she often posted on the way back. So it wasn't a reaction to things, you know. My mother still, to this day, turns up with Christmas presents in September. Because, well, I'm here and I thought that would be convenient. It's all very polite and convenient, but it's not very Christmassy, you know. What am I meant to do? Put them in the bloody cupboard? Ooh, look, I've already seen it. As I said, emotions were incredibly suspect. And the only thing more suspect than that was talking about them. And so what you got was an entire generation of men who came back from World War I and World War II and said not a word about years of trauma and their experience, because the society in no way allowed for that. Some of those men managed to pick themselves up, others drank themselves into an early grave, ruined the lives of wives and children along the way. So when people suggest that we live in rude times today, I just go, you know, I look at the whole encouragement of being able to speak and talk and discuss who you are and to be frank and to be open as just an incredibly civil and wonderful aspect of life today. I look at multiculturalism, a more or less forgotten idea, but a very positive and inclusive approach to society, which at least encourages us to go and try a green chicken curry and perhaps have a chat with the people serving it, you know? I look at ramps for the disabled. I look at how we talk to children. I look at my female head of radio at the ABC. I look at my daughter, who can be anything she wants. I look at the entire decline in sectarian disdain. I still see class and money barriers, but they look kind of quaint and isolated to a few people in Vaucluse who live near Malcolm Turnbull, although he's in Point Piper. I don't miss the hats and gloves. I don't miss the calling cards. I don't miss a letter coming to my wife inscribed Mrs. James Valentine. I also look at modern technology, and we look at, on the form guide, we get all these sort of calls that'll say things like, my friend received a condolence email the other day. I think, goodness, this caller will say, can't people take the time to write a letter, a note to a grieving widow? Is that what we've come to? Well, me and many of my listeners will write and say, Les, look, we understand your problem and we do draw the line at a sad face on the condolence email. But as one widow caller said, and several of others have noticed this, at the time of the death of her husband, she was overwhelmed with condolence notes. There were hundreds. People she didn't know, people who forgot to put addresses. It was this bulky and painful exercise to try and deal with these things. She said she also received emails and went to them with relief. It was easy. No one dashed off a quick email. They wrote thoughtfully and sensitively. She could then reply in time, and it was all there. She could just say, thank you, that's lovely. I'm glad you remember me at this time. See you later. Happened like that. Said it was easy. It was connecting with the people. The entire uptake of modern technology, which so many people seem to think is some sort of curse upon society and destroying manners, the entire uptake, the internet, the mobile phone, the Facebook, the Twitter, is all motivated by a central desire of people to connect with one another, of people to talk with one another, of people to stay in touch, of people to send messages all the time. My ability at friendship is enormously enhanced. And I was a shocking friend. I'd never write you a letter. You'd never get a phone call from me. But if I see you've done something now, bang, I send you a text. If I see something that I think interests you, man, you've got an email straight away. You know, all of these things have been an enormous boon to a more civil society. So I don't, walk in there and walk through those paintings and kind of get filled with any kind of nostalgia for a wonderful time of great civil discourse or anything like that. I look at the world I'm in right now and go, yeah, beauty. Thank you.